I had always wanted a piece of land where I could carve out my own sanctuary, away from the bustling noise of the city. After years of moving from one cramped apartment to the next, I finally found what I was looking for, a beautiful 150-year-old ranch on the outskirts of town. It was more than just a house. It was a legacy, with a rich history, and a sprawling piece of land that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath a sky that was wider than anything I had ever known. The house, weathered but strong, had a charm that only time could bestow. The kind of place where you could imagine your ancestors sitting by the fireplace, telling stories that went back generations. The perfect place for me to settle down, for me to build something of my own. But little did I know, my arrival in this quiet little community would set off a chain of events that would change everything. As soon as I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something off about the neighborhood. There was a certain coldness in the air, a tension I couldn't quite put my finger on. The houses were well kept, pristine even, and there was an unnerving sense of uniformity among them. Neatly trimmed lawns matching mailboxes, the same kind of fences, and perfectly manicured gardens. It was clear that this neighborhood was not just another suburban area. It was an HOA-run community, where the rules were enforced with a level of strictness that bordered on the obsessive. As I unpacked my belongings, I had this feeling that I was being watched, not in a welcoming way, but more like I was an intruder, a disruption to the peace that had reigned for decades. My first encounter with the HOA came on the morning of my third day in the house. A sleek black SUV rolled up to the front of my property, and a sharply dressed man stepped out. He didn't knock on the door. He just stood there for a moment, looking at me through the front window. I opened the door cautiously, unsure what to expect. He introduced himself as Mr. Johnson, the president of the local homeowners association. His tone was polite but firm, almost as if he was trying to assert authority without being overtly hostile. He started off by congratulating me on my new home, but there was something about his smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You must be aware of the rules around here," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made me uneasy. "The HOA has a very specific set of standards that need to be followed to maintain the integrity of the community. We expect our residents to adhere to them." I nodded, unsure what to say. I wasn't particularly interested in a speech about community rules, but I also knew that it wasn't worth arguing over trivial things on the first day. Still, something about his presence felt off, like he was sizing me up. "And of course," he continued, glancing around the property, "we've noticed a few inconsistencies. The historical value of your ranch. For instance, we have a strict policy about how properties in this area must be maintained, and certain renovations might not meet our standards." At this point, I couldn't help but feel like he was questioning my right to live here, my right to make this place my own. The ranch had been standing for over 150 years, and it wasn't going to be brought down by a few cracks in the walls or a creaky floorboard. But Mr. Johnson wasn't done. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he added, "The neighborhood has a reputation to uphold. We have rules in place to prevent any changes that might disturb the harmony of the area. I trust you won't make any sudden alterations." I hadn't planned on doing anything drastic. I was just getting settled in, starting to make the ranch feel like home. But something about his words struck me as patronizing, as though he thought I was some kind of outsider who didn't understand the delicate balance of the community. The conversation ended with a handshake, but it didn't sit right with me. I had always believed in the importance of personal freedom, of living your life on your own terms. And here, in a place that was supposed to be my sanctuary, I was already being told what I could and couldn't do. As Mr. Johnson left, I watched him get back into his SUV, his eyes lingering on my property one last time before he drove off. I felt a gnawing sense of resentment growing in the pit of my stomach. The HOA had already made it clear that they weren't interested in letting me live here on my own terms, and if they thought they could intimidate me, they had another thing coming. Little did I know, the real trouble was just beginning. The next few days were eerily quiet, but I could sense that something was brewing. Every time I stepped outside to tend to my new home, I noticed the same familiar black SUV parked across the street. Always a little too far to be considered casual, but close enough to feel like a constant surveillance. The neighbors, too, started to give me the cold shoulder, exchanging polite but distant nods whenever our paths crossed. It was clear that the HOA had a firm grip on this community, and I was beginning to realize that I might have bitten off more than I could chew. Still, I wasn't the kind of person who backed down easily. I had worked too hard to get here, and there was no way I was going to let anyone, least of all an overly zealous HOA president, tell me how to live my life. But my resolve was tested sooner than I expected. It was on a quiet Sunday afternoon when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment, I hesitated before answering. When I opened the door, I was met with a stern face of Officer Peterson, a man whose presence seemed to carry an air of authority that made me uneasy. Behind him stood another officer, this time a woman, holding a clipboard. "Good afternoon, sir," Officer Peterson said in a voice that left no room for pleasantries. "We've been contacted by the Homeowners Association regarding some concerns about your property." He paused, glancing down at the clipboard before continuing. "They received several complaints about your home's condition and your landscaping, and we've been instructed to conduct a property inspection." I stood there for a moment, processing what he had just said. The HOA had called the cops for a landscaping issue? I thought it was a joke, but the stern look on Officer Peterson's face told me otherwise. "I wasn't aware there were any issues," I replied, my voice calm but firm. "My property's in good condition. I've only just moved in." "Nevertheless," Officer Peterson said, "we need to follow up on these complaints. This is routine." The word routine was said with a level of detachment that made my blood boil. "May we come in?" he asked, though it didn't feel much like a question. At that moment, I knew that this was no coincidence. This wasn't just about a little landscaping discrepancy. This was about control. The HOA had clearly orchestrated this entire situation. They had their hands in every corner of this community, pulling strings and creating an atmosphere of fear and submission. I knew the law enough to understand that they couldn't just send the cops to my door over something so trivial, but the officers weren't backing down. I had two options. I could either resist and make things more difficult for myself, or I could comply and let them conduct their inspection. But it was clear that this was a test to see how far they could push me and whether I would give in to their authority. I chose to stand my ground. "I'm not letting anyone onto my property without a valid reason," I told them, my voice steady but forceful. The officers exchanged glances, and for a moment I thought they might push the issue further. But they didn't. Officer Peterson sighed, looking disappointed, but he didn't argue. Instead, he pulled out a piece of paper from his clipboard and handed it to me. "This is a formal notice of inspection. If you refuse entry, we'll be forced to take further action. You'll receive a citation for obstructing a legal inquiry, and we'll need to involve the local authorities in more serious measures." He didn't say anything more, but the implications were clear. I stood there, the weight of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just about landscaping. This was about power. The HOA, through their connections and influence, had turned a simple residential dispute into something far more serious. I could already see where this was headed, and it wasn't good. With a reluctant nod, I stepped back from the door. "Fine," I said, my words clipped. "You can come in, but I'm not signing anything until I see the documentation." I was going to play by their rules. For now. The inspection itself was perfunctory, nothing more than a quick walk through the property, with the officers making notes about the condition of the lawn, the fence, and the paint on the house. There were a few minor things that could easily be fixed, but nothing that warranted an inspection in the first place. The whole thing felt like a show, a preemptive strike, to remind me who was in charge here. When they finished, Officer Peterson handed me a small stack of paperwork, his eyes cold. "We'll be in touch," he said, turning to leave. As the officers drove away, I stood on the front steps, staring at the stack of papers in my hands. The HOA wasn't just a neighborhood association. They were shadow government, and they were making it clear that I didn't belong here. But I wasn't about to let them run me out of town. I wasn't the kind of person who let bullies get their way. I had a plan, and it was time to put it into action. The following week was a blur of phone calls, meetings, and a constant feeling of being under siege. The HOA's tactics were becoming more aggressive, and I could feel their eyes on me from every corner of the neighborhood. The letters started arriving daily, Complaints, fines, and warnings about everything from the angle of my mailbox to the shade of green the first had chosen for the shutters. It didn't matter that these things were minor, or that they weren't causing any real problems. To the HOA, every single detail of my property was a matter of their control, and I had become their target. I had known that taking on the HOA wasn't going to be easy, but I didn't expect them to play dirty. It felt like I was fighting a faceless entity, an invisible hand that could reach into every corner of my life and disrupt it just because they could. And the worst part was that no one seemed willing to stand up to them. The neighbors stayed quiet, avoiding eye contact whenever we crossed paths. The silence was deafening, and I realized that I had to do something. I couldn't just be another passive resident caught in their web. I began to dig deeper into the HOA's history. I spoke to some of the older residents in town, those who had lived here long before the HOA became the monstrous entity it was today. What I learned was both shocking and enlightening. The HOA had started out as a small group of well-meaning individuals who wanted to keep the neighborhood looking nice. But over the years, their influence had expanded, and they had grown more powerful, more controlling. The rules that had once been about maintaining aesthetic appeal had now become about dictating the way people lived, who they could talk to, what they could do to their own homes, and even how they should raise their children. The HOA had become a quasi-government, with the power to ruin lives, to destroy personal freedoms, and to strip people of their rights without ever having to answer for it. And then, I found out something that changed everything. The HOA president, Mr. Johnson, wasn't just some overzealous neighborhood official. He was a man with a vendetta. It turned out that his family had a long history with the ranch I had purchased. They had once owned the property, but it had been sold under mysterious circumstances. There were rumors that the land had been sold out from under them, and Mr. Johnson had never gotten over the fact that his family had lost their claim to it. He had spent years trying to buy the property back, but the previous owner had refused to sell. Now that I had moved in, I had become the target of his resentment. He wasn't just trying to enforce HOA rules. He was trying to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. I wasn't just a homeowner to him. I was an obstacle to his family's legacy, and he would stop at nothing to get rid of me. The discovery only fueled my determination to fight back. I wasn't going to let some petty feud control my future. I had worked hard for this home, and I wasn't about to let Mr. Johnson or anyone else take it from me. It was time to turn the tables. I didn't know exactly how I was going to do it yet, but I knew I needed to start by taking down the HOA's grip on the community. If I could find a way to make myself the leader of the HOA, I could shift the power dynamic. I could turn their own rules against them. And if Mr. Johnson thought he had the upper hand, he would soon find out that I wasn't the kind of person who could be intimidated. I began attending HOA meetings, sitting in the back and listening, learning how the organization operated. At first, I was met with disdain and suspicion. The other members, mostly older couples who had lived in the community for decades, saw me as an outsider, a troublemaker. But I wasn't there to make waves. I was there to bide my time and gather support. I played the game, smiling and nodding, pretending to be just another resident who wanted to follow the rules. Slowly, I began to make connections. I started talking to people who felt just as trapped by the HOA as I had. They were tired of the micromanagement, tired of feeling like they couldn't even paint their fences without permission. These were people who had lived in the community for years, and they were just as fed up as I was. One by one, I quietly gathered allies. But the most important ally was the one I least expected. During one of the meetings, a woman named Laura approached me. She had been a long-time resident, well-respected in the community, but she had always kept her distance from the HOA. Her house was immaculate, her lawn perfectly manicured, but she had never fully embraced the oppressive nature of the HOA's rules. She told me she had been watching the way the association had been operating, and she didn't like it. She wanted change, but she was afraid. "You can't fight them alone," she said, her voice low but filled with conviction. "But you can't let them keep doing this to people, either. You have the fire, the will to take them down. If anyone can do it, it's you." It was those words that lit a spark in me. I had to do it, not just for myself, but for everyone in that neighborhood who felt trapped by the HOA's stranglehold. With Laura's help, I began to devise a plan. We would take down Mr. Johnson and his allies, one vote at a time. The HOA wasn't a fortress. It was a house of cards, and all it would take was one small push to make it all come crashing down. The days following my conversation with Laura were filled with preparation and quiet maneuvering. I knew that to take control of the HOA, I had to think strategically. The last thing I wanted was for the HOA to label me as a troublemaker before I had even started my campaign. So, I spent the next few weeks playing the part of the ideal neighbor, the kind of person who always followed the rules, showed up to meetings, and made small talk with anyone who would listen. But behind the scenes, I was working on building a coalition. I wasn't just gathering people who were upset with the HOA's overreach. I was looking for those who had influence, those who had been marginalized by the current leadership but had the clout to sway others. I spent hours talking to people in the neighborhood, listening to their stories, and making sure they knew that they weren't alone. It wasn't hard to find discontent. People were fed up. There was talk about the HOA's unreasonably high fees, their demands for immaculate lawns, their restrictions on everything from the type of mailbox you could have to the color of your door. Even those who had followed the rules to the letter had begun to feel like pawns in a game they didn't want to play anymore. I began to realize that I wasn't the only one who felt like an outsider here. I was just the first to stand up and say it out loud. The real turning point came when I attended the next HOA meeting. It was packed with residents, more than I had ever seen before. Mr. Johnson was there, of course, sitting at the front of the room with his usual air of superiority. He glanced at me as I walked in. His expression went a mild disdain, but he didn't say anything. I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was starting to sense that something was off. That was exactly what I wanted. This meeting wasn't about talking about the weather or the neighborhood potluck. It was about showing everyone that the time had come to make a change. As the meeting progressed, I listened carefully. Mr. Johnson's tactics were the same as always: intimidation, condescension, an ever-growing list of rules and regulations. He was trying to ram through a proposal that would increase the HOA fees again, claiming that it was necessary to maintain property values. But as he spoke, I noticed something. People were no longer nodding along in agreement. There were murmurs, whispered conversations between neighbors who had never spoken to each other before. The cracks in Mr. Johnson's power were starting to show. This was my moment. When it came time for open comments, I stood up. The room fell silent, and all eyes were on me. My heart was pounding, but I pushed through the nervousness. I've been here for a few months now, and I've noticed a trend. I began, my voice clear and steady. This neighborhood is supposed to be a community, but instead, we're being suffocated by a set of rules that don't reflect the values most of us share. We're being forced to live under an iron fist, where every decision we make is scrutinized, and every move we make is dictated by a group of people who have no idea what it's like to live like we do. I paused for a moment, letting my words sink in. I could see people nodding in agreement, and I knew I had their attention. I wasn't just speaking for myself. I was speaking for everyone who felt like they were living in a gilded cage, where freedom and individuality were sacrificed for the sake of conformity. We need to take back control of this neighborhood. I continued, and that means starting with the HOA. The way it's been run under Mr. Johnson's leadership has hurt this community, not helped it. We need fresh ideas, new blood, and leadership that actually listens to the people. At that moment, I saw Mr. Johnson's expression shift. He didn't get angry, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. He knew that his grip on the HOA was slipping, but he wasn't going to give up without a fight. "I think we've heard enough," he said, cutting me off. But the murmurs in the room were getting louder, and I could tell that more and more people were on my side. The rest of the meeting proceeded uneventfully, but I could feel the tension in the air. People were talking, whispering to each other in hushed tones. By the time the meeting ended, I had already made up my mind. The next step was clear. I needed to run for president of the HOA. If I could take control of the organization, I could not only dismantle the current leadership, but also reverse the damage they had done to the community. I was no longer just a resident who had been wronged by the system. I was a force to be reckoned with, and the HOA was about to learn that they had underestimated me. The campaign for HOA president didn't take long, but it was a battle of wills. I started by gathering support from the residents who had already spoken to me, those who had been quietly frustrated for years, but hadn't known how to fight back. It was a tight-knit group at first, but as word spread, more and more people began to stand behind me. They were tired of Mr. Johnson's reign, tired of the constant pressure to conform, and tired of feeling powerless in their own homes. The tide was turning, and it was clear that Mr. Johnson no longer had the control he once did. Election day came, and the HOA meeting room was packed. The usual suspects were there, Mr. Johnson, the old guard, and their loyal supporters, who still believed in the sanctity of the HOA's ironclad rules. But the room was different this time. There was a palpable energy in the air, a sense that something was about to change. As the votes were counted, I watched Mr. Johnson closely. He tried to maintain his usual calm demeanor, but I could see the cracks forming. I wasn't the only one watching. Everyone was. People who had never spoken out before were now watching, waiting for the moment they could take their neighborhood back. And when the votes were tallied, the result was undeniable. I had won. By a landslide. The room went silent, and for a brief moment, I wondered if Mr. Johnson was going to protest. But he didn't. He stood up slowly, his face a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect, and offered a handshake. It wasn't sincere, but it didn't matter. I had won the power that I needed, and I wasn't to let him or anyone else take it away from me. Taking the role of HOA president wasn't just a symbolic victory. It was the beginning of real change. I immediately started to dismantle the oppressive rules that had been strangling the community. The fees were reduced, and a new set of guidelines was implemented. Ones that prioritized respect for personal freedom and the diversity of lifestyles that made the neighborhood unique. It was clear that change wasn't going to happen overnight, but I was committed to making it a place where people could feel like they were part of something, where they didn't have to be afraid to be themselves. Mr. Johnson, for all his bluster, had been a victim of his own hubris. He thought that because he had held the reins for so long, he could never be unseated. But in the end, it was a sense of entitlement, his belief that he had the right to dictate how people lived, that had made him weak. I had shown everyone that it was possible to stand up to the HOA and win. I had taken my home back, not just from Mr. Johnson, but from the system that had tried to strip it of its soul. I had reclaimed the ranch, not just as a place to live, but as a symbol of resistance against the forces that sought to control every aspect of our lives. And so, I became a new president of the HOA, but in many ways, I became something much more important. A symbol of freedom, of standing up to oppression, and of the power of community when it chooses to come together and fight for what's right. As for Mr. Johnson, he vanished from the scene. Some say he moved out of town. Others claim he just disappeared into the shadows. But I didn't care. I had what I wanted, the freedom to live on my terms, and that was something no one, not even the HOA, could take away from me.